Well, hello there everyone, and a warm welcome to you all to the second in our teaching series on the book of Hebrews. So pull up a chair and let's get started. Now I want you to imagine that just last week the government issued an order that basically was to persecute Christians. I want you to imagine that you've witnessed a group of Christians being beaten up by a mob in the town centre, and you've been spat upon by a colleague at work and on the street. I want you to imagine that you've just been told about a close friend who's been evicted from her home just because of her Christian faith. I want you to imagine you've had a brick thrown through your window because your neighbours know you're a Christian. Then on the TV news, just imagine that you've watched angry citizens make vicious threats towards Christians and curse the name of Jesus. And finally, a rumour has gone round that anyone attending a church service next week will be arrested. Now, that kind of persecution would be very scary for us all, wouldn't it? But we were hearing last time that that would have been mild compared with what the Christians during Emperor Nero's time in the mid-1860s were having to endure. Nero needed a scapegoat for the great fire that had overcome the city of Rome in AD 64, and he called out the Christians, the ones who were refusing to worship the emperor as God. And we said last time that if you were a Christian from a Jewish background, then you had an escape route. You had a way out from this kind of persecution. Because all you had to do was disown the name of Jesus and return to the synagogue, return to your old Jewish faith, and you would have been okay. Judaism was still an allowed religion in those days. So it was also very, very easy to escape the persecution. You could save your skin and maybe that of your family as well. And the writer to the Hebrews is writing to Hebrew Christians to say, don't do it. Please don't do it. So how's he going to persuade these people not to do it? What arguments is he going to use to persuade these Christians to remain true to the gospel, even though the consequence would be some of the persecution that we've been describing? Well, today I'm going to speak through from the beginning of the book of Hebrews, so chapter 1 verse 1 through to chapter 2 verse 4, and we'll see the beginning of his arguments. Hope you've all had a chance to read this passage. I was urging you last time to give it a read before listening to this talk. If you haven't yet had the chance to read it, then why not pause this video right now and grab yourself a Bible and read the passage for yourself before you hear my take on it. So it's chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 2 verse 4. So a moment for you to pause. Okay then, well, you'll see as you start to read Hebrews that it starts off very abruptly, doesn't it? There are no opening pleasantries, as you'll often find in other New Testament letters, those written by Paul. He normally starts off by saying things like, grace to you all, peace to you all in the name of the Lord Jesus. Then he might say something encouraging like, I'm glad to see you're all carrying on in the faith, this kind of thing. Now, there's nothing like that at the start of Hebrews. And I believe the reason for that is that his message is too serious. He has to get down to business straight away. So, let's get down to business straight away, shall we? And the heading coming up on the screen now is the first of three headings I'm going to give for this talk. And his first appeal for Jewish Christians to stay with Jesus is this: Jesus is very great. Jesus is very great. And he's going to show us in chapter 1 that in fact Jesus is much greater than the angels. Now we're going to come to angels in a minute and why it was important for the writer to compare Jesus with the angels. But before we get on to angels, let's follow chapter 1. And what chapter 1 is doing is giving us 7 facts about Jesus. And we're going to see who Jesus really is by the end of chapter 1. So, before I go through the 7 facts, let me just give a little challenge to you. So, how big is your Jesus? Let me ask that question to you. How big is your Jesus? Surely he's more to you than just a Jesus in your pocket. You know, you kind of bring him out when you need a little bit of help in life. Oh, Jesus, I just need to find a parking space now. Or, oh, Jesus, I just need to have some healing now. So you kind of pull him out from your pocket. And when you've finished, you put him back in again until the next time. Well, the writer to the Hebrews is going to bring us all a challenge. Jesus is much too big to fit in your pocket. So here are the 7 facts you'll find in Hebrews chapter 1. Here's the first one. Jesus has been appointed the heir of all things. Verse 2. Now, to be an heir means that you've been promised something. So, what has the Father promised to Jesus? Well, let's have a look at Psalm 2, and a verse that inspired Terry Virgo and the founders of the New Frontiers movement of churches in its early years. This is Psalm 2, verse 8. This is God speaking, God the Father, I will make the nations your, that's Jesus, I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. Psalm 2, verse 8. So this is the promise of God the Father to God the Son, to Jesus. And so, Terry Virgo used to say to us, let's get involved with co-working with God to make this promise come true. Let's go to the nations. And we used to sing songs to that effect. And every year we'd all meet, sometimes 20,000 of us, at the Stoneleigh conference near Coventry in the middle of England. And I remember for the last 2 conferences, Terry would stand up on the stage and he would simply read out the names of all the nations in the world. Just starting with, I guess, Afghanistan, maybe ending up with Zambia. All the nations of the world would be read out. And the rest of us, thousands of us gathered in that meeting, would just be in prayer. And we would be believing that the gospel was indeed going to be ringing out to all the nations in the world. And so Jesus, the Son of our Father, would receive his inheritance. This is our Jesus, appointed the heir of all things. He's greater than the angels and everyone else. Number 2, fact about Jesus. It is through Jesus that the universe was made. This is verse 2 again. So right now, just go and touch something in the room where you are. So there you are. That's my bookcase I'm touching. Now, let's say together, Jesus made this. Come, let's say it together now. 1, 2, 3. Jesus made this. So ultimately, looking at my bookcase, when you work your way back past the retailer, back past the manufacturer, back past the provider of the raw materials to the ultimate raw materials, you end up with maybe precious metals, maybe trees or whatever. You end up with materials that Jesus made. Jesus made them. It was Jesus who made this planet with just the right balance of gases in the air. It was Jesus who made this planet just the right distance from the sun. It was Jesus who made this planet with just the right availability of water to support lives. This is the book of Colossians, chapter 3, verse 16. Chapter 1, verse 16. For by him, Jesus, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. This is our Jesus. He made the universe. He's greater than the angels, and he's greater than anyone else. Here's the third fact about Jesus. Jesus is the radiance of God's glory. Now, verse 3. Now, this word glory is perhaps the one single word that best sums up what God is like. There is a glorious, holy, mind-blowing radiance shining out from God. And that's why Moses was not permitted to look upon his face. That would have been fatal for him. I guess the nearest we can get to imagining Jesus like this is to climb the mountain with Peter, James and John, climb up Mount Hermon, where they witnessed the transfiguration of Jesus. For just a few moments, they saw Jesus in his glory, radiating something of the glory of the Father, sufficient for it to be stupendously glorious to the onlookers. This is Mark describing the scene in his Gospel. There he was, transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. This is our Jesus, the radiance of God's glory. He's greater than the angels and anyone else. Here's the fourth fact about Jesus. He is the exact representation of his being, of God's being. Well, I guess you've all heard of the phrase that whereby a son or a daughter of yours is a chip off the old block. Have you heard that phrase? To be a chip off the old block. And it just means that the child has inherited certain qualities from his or her parents. And you can say, that one is a chip off the old block, is what we say. Now then, I've got two children, as most of you know, Jenny and Phil. They're grown-ups now. And just occasionally, I catch them saying something or doing something that reminds me of what I used to be like when I was their age. Or maybe what Glenda, their mother, used to be like when they were her age. It's like a character trait has been passed down the line. So we say, Jenny or Phil, chip off the old block. Now, happily for our children, they are not the exact representations of our beings. You see, they've also developed personalities of their own. So Jenny is her own woman now, and Phil is his own man. You'll just only very occasionally get glimpses of their mum or dad in things they say or do, only occasionally. But Jesus is different. He is the exact representation of his Father's being. Whatever the Father is like, that's what Jesus is like as well. So when you're praying to Jesus, please never imagine him as being like the poor relation to his Father. That to get full value, you're better off praying to God the Father and to Jesus himself. Better off praying to the true boss. No, that's not true at all. Jesus is the exact representation of his Father. He's greater than the angels. Number 5, it is Jesus that sustains all things by his powerful word. Verse 3. So Jesus is not only involved in the creation of this world, but in sustaining it as well. Now in Greek mythology, there is a character called Atlas, who is punished for his rebellion against the Greek gods by being required to hold up the world forever with his powerful muscles. Here's a picture of him you can see now. Now, that of course is a myth. It doesn't really happen, it's a story from old. But the sustaining work of Jesus in this world is presented to us in Hebrews as a fact. And furthermore, for Jesus, this is work that is relatively effortless. He is that great. But of course, one day this task will end, and Jesus will have to bring this tired old world of ours to an end, and then recreate it gloriously into a perfect new earth, this time one of infinite life, for us to live in with him. This is our Jesus. He sustains all things by his powerful word. He's greater than the angels and anyone else. 2 more to go. Number 6. And then we find, verse 3, that Jesus provided purification for sins. And suddenly we move away from the kind of cosmic functions of Jesus, creating this, sustaining that, and so on, to something that affects us directly. It's more like a personal thing all of a sudden. It's about his personal relations with us. For Jesus is our great high priest, and he achieves something for us that no one else and no amount of animal sacrifices could ever achieve. Now Hebrews is going to return to this theme later on, so I won't say anything more about it now. But it just means that as we consider Jesus, we just move perhaps in our response from one of just tremendous awe for Jesus in his glory, in what he does with creating and sustaining the world, to gratitude. We're suddenly personally grateful for who Jesus is and what he has done. It was Jesus that provided purification for sins. The angels didn't do that. Jesus is greater than the angels. And then finally, number 7, Jesus sat down at the right hand of the Father in heaven. Well, I wonder what this picture throws up for you. To sit down at the right hand of God implies equality of status, because everybody else in heaven right now would be standing or kneeling or probably prostrate before the throne of the Father. But Jesus is sitting down, and that means that he has a throne to sit down on as well. This is Tom Wright, the commentator, and he says this: Jesus being able to sit down, quote, speaks of the enthronement of God's true king at God's right hand, and of the sovereign rule which he will exercise until everything that thwarts his purposes of justice and salvation is defeated. My friends, this is our Jesus. This is him. He is greater than the angels, and he's greater than everything else. Well, my second heading should be pretty obvious now. Let's just state it. Focus on the angels suddenly. And Jesus is greater than the angels. Yep, we've said that quite a few times. Now, worryingly for all of you listening tonight, we're still only on verse 3 of chapter 1. But happily, we can do the rest of chapter 1 pretty quickly. Because what the rest of chapter 1 is saying, it's speaking to the Jewish Christians of old who are thinking about falling away. And it's saying, you guys who are considering turning your back on Jesus, it just must be obvious to you now that Jesus is greater than the angels. It must be obvious to you now that Jesus is magnificent. He is glorious. He is sovereign. He is God. He's therefore much greater than the angels. Now, why this emphasis on angels? We keep coming back to them. And the reason for this is that Jewish people held angels in very high regard indeed. Because after all, was it not angels that were put in charge of guarding the Garden of Eden? And were not angels mediators between God and Moses when the law was first given on Mount Sinai? And for Jews, the law is God's greatest gift to mankind. It shows them how to live in a way that commands the blessing of God. And at its heart were the 10 Commandments, quickly running through them. Worship no other God but the one true God. Don't worship idols. Don't misuse God's name. Remember to take a Sabbath rest every 1 day in 7. Honour your parents. And don't murder, commit adultery, steal, lie or covet your neighbour's possessions. So these laws were all so very precious to Jewish people. It shaped their culture and their identity. It showed them how they could command the blessing of God. And involved in the giving of God's law were the angels. This is Galatians chapter 3 verse 19. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. And here we go. And it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. And the intermediary being, of course, Moses. So angels were considered to be very special heavenly beings. But the writer to the Hebrews is surprisingly dismissive in chapter 1 when talking about angels. He quotes from the Old Testament 7 times, you can read it for yourself, to say quite simply that angels have none of the attributes of Jesus that we've just been considering. And he concludes in verse 14 by saying that when all's said and done, angels, however powerful they might seem, are still just servants of God, rather than living embodiments of him as Jesus is. No angel sits before God, and no angel sits at his right hand. Well, I think the writer to the Hebrews has made his point pretty convincingly, don't you? And for us, I trust that our view of Jesus has been magnified 1,000,000 times just by reflecting on who Jesus actually is. So Jesus in our pockets for when we're in a pickle? I really hope not. We're talking Jesus now. Now, there is a final section to our study today, because on the back of his proof that Jesus is greater than the angels comes his first warning for us not to backslide away from Jesus. And this is to be found in the first 4 verses of chapter 2. And I just want to pick out just 2 words from this section, and they are the words drift away. So here's my 3rd heading coming up now. Don't drift away from following Jesus. Verse 1 says this of chapter 2. We must pay more attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. And there's a suggestion of danger in this verse, isn't there? In fact, Hebrews is talking about danger throughout. Now, I can remember the days when our family used to go down to the seaside and our children were very small. And what our children would love us to do was to blow up a little plastic dinghy so that they could climb inside and float on the waves. And they'd be shrieking with excitement. It would be very, very exciting. But one of us would always have to hold the dinghy at the end of a rope. Otherwise, it would drift away. And suddenly something that was meant to be a lot of fun would be something that would be very dangerous. Our kids would be in danger. So the writer to the Hebrews warns, in the same way, don't drift away from Jesus. And this is a warning that many Christians need, perhaps especially those who've grown up in a Christian family or as part of a church community, because it's all too easy just to start taking it all a bit too easy. Perhaps allowing other people to do the praying, the thinking, the giving, the serious business. Not to bother attending meetings as often as you could do. In other words, just to drift along. And the problem is that if we haven't got our own motor running, just to change the picture a little bit into running a motorboat, and if our hand isn't on the tiller, then we end up just drifting further and further away in our allegiance to King Jesus, maybe without even realising it. Well, any resistance to a sea current that's flowing against us, and remember Hebrews was written to a community of people that were going against the current in society, and we are too, maybe not to the same extent, but we're not going with the flow, we're going against the flow as Christian people today. So any resistance to this sea current requires some effort, whether we're holding on to a dinghy or we're being an engine in a motorboat. So to avoid drifting away as Christians requires effort on our part. Now here's a thought for you. Why don't you get hold of a Christian concordance and look up the word effort, and you'll be surprised how many times the word effort appears in your Bibles. It's just part of the package of following Jesus. So here's the writer's first warning to drifters. How shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? Chapter 2, verse 3. Now what's this? Is the writer to the Hebrews saying that it's possible for us Christians, us believers, to lose our salvation if we drift away from Jesus? Now that's a big question that many people ask when they read through Hebrews for the first time. Is it possible for Christians to lose their salvation? Well, we're going to tackle it head on in our studies of Hebrews because it's there time and time again throughout the book. So we're going to honestly tackle this question, just not today though, because my time's almost up. But we do need to feel the force of the writer's warning. Given everything we know about Jesus, how can we turn our back on him? How could we do it? Those 7 facts about Jesus that we heard about earlier. In the light of that, how can you turn your back on Jesus? Because to do so, even if we're trying to escape from a horrible persecution, is to put ourselves into a greater danger. So don't do it, says the writer. Don't drift. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. We're there. We've made a start. Chapter 1 now done, the first 4 verses of chapter 2. And it was full of rich, rich truth, wasn't it? Well, next time we're going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 2 verse 5 through to chapter 3 verse 6. And it'd be great if you could read it in advance. And that's what I'm going to be speaking on then. So once again, many thanks for listening. Take care, everyone. And God bless you all.
Thank you for tuning in. We hope you have enjoyed today's teaching and that it is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, please contact us via Facebook Messenger or email us at office@hopechurchthetford.org. We will be glad to hear from you and will endeavour to get back to you as soon as possible. Tune in again next week. We are currently meeting in person on Friday nights. If you'd like to attend one of our services, please let us know and we will send you the link of where you can book in. Have a blessed week.